Loughborough Independent. In this video, I'm going to be providing an update to the Schools Bill, which is reaching the final stages at the House of Lords. You may recall in our last video the bill was still at the committee stage, and we had planned to do a follow-up video when it moved out from that stage. But when we came to look at the amendments to Part 3, there weren't any. A lot of really positive amendments had been proposed during the committee stage, but none of them had made it through to the agreed form at the end. The bill then moved through the report stage, and there have been some relevant amendments, which we're going to cover in this talk. The bill is now on to its third reading in the House of Lords, the final bit before it moves back to the House of Commons. There's scope for some amendments here, but it's unlikely there are going to be any of any great significance. There can only be amendments on issues that haven't already been discussed. So this is more or less where we're going to be when the bill moves to the House of Commons. There has been a lot of political upheaval though in the last few weeks. We're not certain who the next Prime Minister is going to be at this time, and we're not sure what their priorities are going to be. There's a new Education Secretary, there may be yet another new one in a few weeks, who can say? So while this is probably the end of the line for the House of Lords, there's still potential for a lot of change in the future. We're going to be focusing on Part 3 of the bill today, and do remember this bill only applies in England. Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland all have their own education systems. It's a separate issue. The first element of the bill is the same as ever, the register. Local authorities will be required to keep a register of children who are in the area and not attending a relevant school, which is a state school, an academy or a registered independent school. Their register is going to include the child's name, their address, their date of birth, the names and addresses of any parents, such details of the way in which the child is being educated as may be prescribed. And if you've watched my previous video, you know my issue with these words. It's broad. We don't know what is going to be prescribed by regulations in the future. We don't know how onerous this obligation is going to be on parents. There were attempts in the House of Lords to restrict this bit. They didn't succeed. The next bit, however, is a significant change. The register must also contain such information about the following matters as may be prescribed, to the extent that the local authority have the information or can reasonably obtain it. The child's protected characteristics, including race, religion, disability, whether the child has any special educational needs, any actions taken by the local authority in regard to a Section 47 inquiry, that's to do with child protection, whether the child is a child in need, again that's child protection, and whether the child is a looked after child, so whether they're in the foster system. The reasons why the child is not registered at or attending a relevant school, including information provided by the parents, or the fact that information has not been provided by the parents, whether it's been identified that the child is not attending school or receiving suitable education otherwise. These are the children the bill claims to be able to be protecting, the invisible children. This is what it's meant to be all about. But I'd argue that in that case, the register should be restricted to just these students, and I'm going to go into that in a bit more depth at the end of the video. The register should also include the school or type of school the child attends or attended in the past, whether support is being provided to the child, and if so, what, any actions taken with regard to school attendance orders, which we'll also discuss later, any other information about the child's circumstances, needs, or interaction with the local authority or educational institutions that the Secretary of State thinks should be included for the purposes of safeguarding education, safety, or welfare of children. That is tremendously broad and imprecise and gives the local authority the opportunity to ask an awful lot of questions and demand answers. And any other information the local authority deems appropriate. And regulations may make provision about how the register is to be kept and amended, the form of the register, who's going to have access to it, registration forms, and publicising the register. All of that is up in the air. We don't know what those regulations are going to say. What we do know, and what is a positive amendment that's come through from the report stage, is this. No information may be published or made accessible to the public in any form which includes the name or address of a child or parent, or from which the identity of the child or parent may be deduced if combined with other published information. That's really important, and it is a really positive amendment because there are families for whom privacy and safety are one and the same. So at least we can see the plan that those children are protected, and there was a real push in the House of Lords about this one. So it's a relief to see that that at least has come through. So what are the parents' obligations with the register? Parents need to inform the local authority if the child is eligible and supply names, addresses, dates of birth of the child, and names and address of the parent. But they are not required at the outset to provide any of the other information we've talked about. The local authority may request this information and any other information that may be prescribed, and the parent must also inform the local authority of any changes of information or if the child ceases to be eligible for registration. If the local authority makes a request for information, they'll set a date by which it has to be done. That has to be no less than 15 days, and the parent has to comply with it. If there's a change in the child's circumstances, the parent is under an obligation to update the register within 15 days, unless the child's become registered at a relevant school, in which case the school takes responsibility for that. There's also an obligation placed on education providers. If there's an education provider providing out-of-school training or teaching without the parent present for more than a prescribed time, they can be required by the local authority to confirm that they are providing this information and give the names and addresses and dates of birth of their students who are eligible to be on the register and the names and addresses of their parents. And if they fail to do so, or if they provide incorrect information, they can be fined. Worryingly, it doesn't specify knowingly provide incorrect information, so that does impose quite a risk to education providers. And we don't know the breadth of this, because we don't know what specified time, prescribed time, is going to mean. Does it mean the Saturday morning ballet class, or does it only apply to a quasi-school situation where the child is away from their parents, being educated by somebody else 5 days a week? At this stage, there's no way of knowing. What does the local authority do with all this information? The local authority can give the information from the register to the Secretary of State, or to any prescribed person to protect the welfare of a child, or to another local authority if the child is moving between areas, so to keep the system up to date. What do home educating families and all families get in exchange for this? Well, the local authority must provide support to promote the education of a child on the register, if requested by the parents. But although this specifically includes financial support, it's only such support as the local authority sees fit. And there's no indication there's going to be an additional budget for this. So realistically, it's unlikely to be a significant change. Maddeningly, there was a really positive amendment proposed here, a right for all home educated children to access GCSE exams for free. Anyone who's reached this stage knows how extremely expensive the exams are, and they are a real barrier to home educated children achieving on the same level academically as children within the school system. Most of the students we teach take about 5 IGCSEs. Most children within the school system take 10 to 11. This is not because our children are any less able. We have some exceptionally bright, dedicated students. But with exams costing about £150 per subject, it is automatically limiting on what home educating families can afford. If this amendment had come through, it would make a genuine difference to the children that the government claimed to be caring about and concerned about. But unfortunately, that amendment did not make it into the bill. If you care to write to your MP about it, I think that would be an excellent idea. There's then an administrative section of the bill where it talks about movement of regulations and things, but the next key section for home educators is the school attendance orders issue. It's caused a lot of concern for home educators, but it's a bit of an odd issue, as I'm going to explain. The local authority must send a preliminary notice of a school attendance order, which is basically a warning, telling the parent they must show the child is receiving a suitable education. And they can send this, they must send this, if they believe that the person they're sending it to is the parent of the child, and A, they think the child is not receiving a suitable education, B, they think the child is eligible to be on the register and have requested that information and the parent has not supplied the information within the period of 15 days, or C, the parent is under a duty to provide information and has failed to do so, or has provided incorrect information. Again, it doesn't say knowingly provided incorrect information. And the notice gives the parent no less than 10 days to fix this. But the notice actually only requires that the parent prove or demonstrate that their child is receiving a suitable education. the notice does not require them to provide any of the information we've talked about. And I would argue that it's entirely possible to show that your child is receiving a suitable education without all that information. So it's a very strangely worded bit of statute that they're proposing here. If the parent fails to satisfy the local authority that the child is receiving a suitable education, and again, not fails to provide the relevant information, just fails on that point, then a school attendance order can be imposed, which requires the person to cause the child to become registered at the school named on the order. The bill goes then into a lot of detail on how parents can influence which school their child is to attend, or how they can get the order amended at a later date to reflect the child changing schools. A parent with a child who does not have an EHC plan can also apply for the order to be revoked. And if the local authority is satisfied that arrangements have been made for the child to receive a full-time suitable education, then they have to revoke it. They're obliged to do so. However, children with an EHC plan can't have the order revoked. Once they have moved back into the school system, there's no way back there, unless possibly through challenge through the courts. But the key issue here is that there aren't any relevant changes to the legislation that I can see. There's been a lot of concern over these orders, but a school attendance order can already be imposed if a child isn't receiving a suitable full-time education. And they can already be amended and revoked in exactly these ways. This section of the bill does nothing to change the position of home-educated children, except for one provision. If you fail to comply with the school attendance order, if you fail to enrol your child in the school that the local authority has specified, then you can receive a fine of up to level 3, which is already the case, and or a prison sentence not exceeding 51 weeks. Failure to enrol your child when the school attendance order has been imposed leads to potentially a year of imprisonment. This fine was already a risk, as I've said, but the imprisonment is new. The government apparently feel that the best way to protect the well-being of a child may be to remove the parent for up to a year. And in the absence of any other issues which would probably be sentenced separately, it's hard to see any justification for that. This has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the bill, and if you've made it this far, well done. I've been watching the progress of the bill, and there's one major issue that stands out to me. The justification for Part 3 is that there are children who are effectively invisible. They're missing from education, they're missing from society, they're being let down. They are very vulnerable to abuse. And the supporters of this bill can point to terrible, tragic cases where young people have been subject to neglect and abuse because there's no one in the system who's aware of their existence. There's no one who's got their back. And anyone would agree that those children need to be protected. But that is not what this bill does. For all the words that we've talked about in Part 3, the only significant changes are these: that there will be a register of children who are not in school, and that the parents who can't satisfy the local authority that their child is receiving a suitable education and then fail to enrol their child in school could receive almost a year in prison. I invite you to imagine this bill has come into effect. There are, to my mind, 3 types, broadly, of people who'd be affected. Group A are the lifelong home educators, those for whom this has always been the plan, or from a very early age. Group B are what I'd call the circumstantial home educators. They started off in school, but then, for one reason or another, they've removed their child from school because they believe that's in their child's best interests. Or Group C, the dodgy ones, who don't care about giving their child an education. I know plenty of Group A's. They may not be keen to register their children, they may be quite reluctant to have state involvement in that way. But the ones I know are all registered with doctors, dentists, where they can find them, opticians. These children are not unseen. The risk for them is that they're likely to follow a different approach to education to that which you'd see in the mainstream. And that's perfectly legal. But the bill leaves them at significant risk because it changes the relationship between the local authority and these families. It creates a more suspicious environment. And it may be that if the local authority doesn't agree with this perfectly legal approach to education, they may feel empowered to remove that option from the parents to impose a school attendance order. I also work with a lot of Group B families. These are conscientious parents who've chosen to home educate because their child is being let down somewhere within the system. They are definitely not unseen. They are probably very well known to the education departments and to the schools because they've had to fight every step of the way. These families are at risk because the local authority may disagree with their decision to remove their child from school, and there may be a history of disagreements with the school and with the local authority that's led to this, meaning the local authority may be already prejudiced against them and not willing to accept that their route through education is an appropriate one for that child. So they're at risk. But the Group C's are the ones that this bill is meant to be targeting. I don't think it does. Group A and B are already likely to be in conversations with the local authority, whether those conversations are amicable or not. These children are seen and their parents are generally passionate about their education. But the Group C's, they're likely to be invisible, and they're also likely to be the people least affected by this register. Their parents are not going to comply with these rules unless the local authority pushes them to do so. And here's the thing. There is already a duty on the local authority to maintain a list of children not receiving education in school or otherwise. Under Section 436A of the Education Act of 1996, as introduced by Section 4 of the Education and Skills Act of 2008, local authorities are under a duty to identify children not receiving an education. Local authorities must make arrangements to identify children of compulsory school age in their area who are not registered pupils at a school and are not receiving suitable education otherwise than at school. This list already exists, so this bill is aimed at home educators, and there's no justification given for that. Thank you for listening today. I urge you to contact your MP with your concerns on this bill. We're passionate about giving our best to our children, and this is one way in which we can do that. Thank you. Goodbye.